Noel, thank you for your presence this morning, and thank you for reading the scriptures for us. I appreciate that. And if you remember, we kept the Christmas trees up for the entire month of January on purpose to remind us that even though yesterday we had 67 degrees and sunshine, the rest of the country is not experiencing that, right? Many of our friends are really struggling today. And that we are also tending, in spite of the fact that it looks and feels like spring to us, we are intentionally tending this month to the roots of our spiritual life and to cultivating what Jesus did in his life in order to be a powerfully spiritual person. The peace of Jesus Christ be with you today. Also with you. Thank you. I received that peace today. The car. When I was a teenager, I had an obsession with cars. Truly an obsession. I couldn't wait to drive. I bought car magazines. I knew all the automobile companies and could tell you every single model that they made. If you showed me a piece of a taillight or a section of a bumper, I could usually tell you the name, the brand, the make, and what model it was. And my first job when I was 16 years old was at a BMW Volkswagen dealership. And I washed the cars for the showroom and for delivery. It was one of my favorite jobs that I've ever had. Some of you may remember the BMW 2002. That was a very sweet car. However, I did have a dream car, all those car magazines, you know, and it was the Mercedes-Benz 450 SL Sport Coupe. This was my dream as a teenager. Soft top, two-seater Sport Coupe. Don't laugh. In its day, it was really comparable to a Bentley. Okay? So fast forward a few years, I went to college in Tulsa, Oklahoma. And I worked my entire college years for a couple, Chuck and Sherry Ramsey, who owned a jewelry wholesale company. And they were a delightful company. It was a fun company, but they were a delightful couple who I really enjoyed. And the husband was what you might call an eccentrically driven entrepreneur. He was always looking for the deal. When he'd go to the airport and I would take him there, and then, usually he'd drive and I'd come back. Like literally, I would look out the side because he would be racing through traffic so bad that I was afraid. So during the 4 years that I worked for them, my favorite side job was I got to take care of their 3 cars. And he had a Mercedes 450 SL Coupe. And during the 4 years that I worked for them, he went through 3 of them. A blue one, a gold one, and a brown one. And because I took care of them, he allowed me to use the 450 whenever I wanted to, for a date, for a sunny day, and trust me, on an Oklahoma sunny day, in a 450 going down the highway, I was out of this world. Like, it was my dream. I was not raised around wealth. So when I drove that Mercedes-Benz, it transported me into a completely different world. And besides this Mercedes, he also had a third car which nobody used. Do you remember, anybody remember the German car Opel Kadets? Do you remember? Oh, a lot of people do remember it. That's great. I didn't think anyone would know. Well, the keys sat in that ignition all the time, and all I had to do was jump the fence, and I got to use it all week long if I wanted to. The point is that I had never experienced anything remotely generous like this in my life. Chuck and Sherry, my bosses, they were by far the most generous people that up until that point in my life I had ever met. And it was their open-handed generosity of spirit that had a lifelong impact on who I am today, 60 years later. 50 years later. They were my life-changing example of what generosity could actually look like. I didn't have any concept of what that was like. And I wanted to become that. Whatever that was, I wanted to be that. And for me, that Mercedes-Benz experience over those 4 years was more life-changing than if they had gifted me a full-run scholarship through college. I honestly mean that. So, given I was going to give this example for this sermon, I called Chuck and Sherry yesterday, just to let them know that I appreciated them and to say hi, and that I would be sharing this story. They are now in their 80s, and age has definitely caught up with them. And as we're saying goodbye, just randomly, completely unsolicited, Chuck, who was this eccentric guy who constantly was chasing the next deal, says to me, "You know, Dave, money isn't really all that important. You may have a lot of drive," and I'm sure he's referring to himself when he said that, "but money really doesn't have that much meaning overall." This was his goodbye to me. Last thing he said. So, I'd like for you to take a moment and think for yourself, go back in the files of your life, the story files of your life, and I have a few questions for you. Is there one personal encounter, like what I had, that stands out to you personally, where you were the recipient of radical generosity of spirit? You only have to come up with one, but hold it, because there's probably many for those of us that have lived a full life. But is there one particular example that you go, that blew my mind? What did that feel like for you? I'd like you to relive it this morning. Like, just soak it in. This is a Sabbath day when you get to reflect and let God speak to you and be ministered to. Like, just soak in that a little bit, okay? And as a result of that experience for you, is there any particular long-term impact on the way you live now? Has that informed some of your decisions? Has that directed who you have become today? I honestly think that the scripture reading today that Noel offered us, from the water being changed into wine, is a fantastic, personal, specific example of that same spirit of generosity that I experienced with Chuck and Sherry. I really do liken the two to each other. Encountering unexpected, undeserved generosity should be life-giving. And the water to wine story, of course, is very well known, so we don't need to go over the whole thing. But John claims that this happened at the very beginning of Jesus' ministry, and he makes a specific point that his disciples were with him at this wedding. And there's a few noteworthy things just as a reminder. Cana was not an important metropolitan city. This was a rural farming agricultural community, a small, pretty much unimportant town. Keep in mind, culturally Jewish weddings were 7 days. They were held at the parents' home. And it's easily understandable how you could either miscalculate people's consumption of wine or simply just not have enough money to stock up on the wine supply, and in hopes that your guest would drink moderately, right? The real problem, though, underlying all of it, though, was the cultural shame issue. The story doesn't spell this out directly because at that time, everyone that read the story would have been completely aware of it, is that the wedding couple is about to quickly experience an extremely negative impact on this celebration. But even more dreadful will be the long-lasting cultural shame for this entire family. And we've seen this happen even in our day through social media and technology, right? It has destroyed people's lives, or it can. And in this case, their lives are about to be known as, this is the family who ran out of wine. This is a nightmare for them. Not for the guests, for this family. And even in the most gracious of cultures, this would feel devastating. And can you imagine in that moment who is blaming whom in that family? Can you imagine your family and this happening? Who would be blaming it? Like, what would the dialogue be going on behind the scenes of that party, right? So what's interesting to me is, who did Jesus actually specifically involve in this particular miracle? Who did he actually assign it to? Do you remember? Who would you say? The servants. Unknown town, right? And the servants get the job of doing this. And he says, fill them up to the brim, these 6 jars. Keep in mind, these 6 jars, filled to the brim, are somewhere between 120 and 180 gallons of wine. That's what the size actually states. He says, fill them to the brim, and then he says, now go take this to the master of the ceremonies. Do you think they might have been just a little afraid going to the master of ceremonies? Doesn't say that they drank it. It says, like, now go take it to him. And they're the ones that have to deliver this message. Imagine how this impacted this family. The parents were spared public humiliation. The wedding couple was completely remembered for this amazing gift of wine at their ceremony. And the guests were overwhelmed with surprise and joy. But who was forever impacted? Whose lives were changed? It was those that probably experienced it on a very personal level. Just like I experienced the generosity of a Mercedes 450 SL. It's the family. The servants never forgot this. And who else did John make sure you knew was there? The disciples. This was a turning point for them, to know who they were following. It's important that we experience a personal reference point for what the radical generosity of God really looks and feels like. We really do have to encounter this for ourselves. It can be here, but when it shifts from here to here, that's when it changes to, I want to become that, whatever that is. In this month's sermon series, we've been looking at what were the spiritual pinnings of Jesus' life that made him such a spiritually powerful person while he walked this earth. And we started off with it was his belovedness. Remember the practice that we said, God is very fond of me. The second was developing a rhythm for finding solitude to reconnect with God. The challenge was build yourself a Sabbath. Create it out of the depths of your despair and your thinness. Last week, Rachel reminded us that the next thing Jesus constantly did, he strategically picked friends around his life, those disciples, and he called a community, a beloved community around him, to be part of and to be committed to. And today what we see is that he developed this embodiment of this generosity of spirit that could have only come from his connection with the Father. And this is how he built 3 years of ministry to the final end of his death. But there were very specific ways that he showed his generosity, right? For me, what mattered to me in college was it was this car thing that I was obsessed with. But there are different ways that Jesus exemplified it that I'm sure really landed for people in very, very personal terms. So let's just real quickly go through these, okay? First you have at the core this water into wine, which really represents God's unbelievable generosity towards you. The next out is the way Jesus treated people. He saw the image of God in every person. Everyone was human, not bad, not good, but made in God's image. particularly for those that were on the margins, for the way he treated women, for the way he treated lepers, and for those that were on the margins and being outcast. And look at the way he treated children. He always saw the individual. That is an expression of that we can embody. That is the radical generosity of Christ. The next was he had this deep compassion for suffering. He had a healing ministry. He didn't just heal a few people. Like, let's call it what it was. He had a healing ministry. He fed thousands of people at times. And he offered justice to people one-on-one who were experiencing the harshness of both the Roman and the Jewish law. He restored back into the Jewish faith the spirit of the law, even when he said, the Sabbath was not made for you to do your rituals, it was made for man to be refreshed. Next, he had this open-handed expression constantly of empowerment. He gave his ministry away to his disciples, sent them out, gave them authority, spiritual authority that they did not have, that was beyond themselves. And he restored people's identity. Their true identity came back. And their purpose and calling was renewed. This is an interesting one that oftentimes we overlook. Financial freedom. Jesus' generosity spirit wasn't focused on money any more than any other category, but he never excluded money from his expressions of generosity. And I've never heard a sermon on this before, but he starts with this small group of disciples, but over 3 years, this small rural phenomenon ends up to be an entire spiritual movement that has now threatened the Jewish authorities and the Roman authorities. And we tend to overlook the fact that a spiritual movement like this, of this magnitude, when it grows that large, it requires a financial structure underneath it to fund the movement. This is another story for another sermon. But I told you I went to school in Oklahoma. I grew up and lived around Christian healing ministries. And what I can tell you from firsthand experience, when people get healed, their pocketbook opens up. It is an automatic trigger that they are so grateful, so thankful. Nothing could solve the problem that they were experiencing. That money just doesn't matter to them, and they give freely. I believe that Jesus' ministry experienced just a flood of outpouring of finances. It says that he was supported particularly by 3 very wealthy women. One was married to the palace manager of Herod's palace. I want to acknowledge, too, women hold the church together. I saw it during COVID firsthand. When we had to shut down for a year and a half, women stepped to the forefront, and I can tell you, they held everything together in this place through that difficult time. I think it's beautiful that the scriptures say that 3 wealthy women did this. And the Gospels state that he was always distributing money to the poor, that there was a money box, a treasury box, Judas was over it, and that he was stealing from it. But constantly you see these references to they were giving money to the poor. How he did it, I don't know. And I want to acknowledge that we are extremely generous. You are a generous congregation. Of our $1.9 million budget, 10% of it all goes to ministries and nonprofits locally and internationally. And beyond that, our Christmas and our Easter offering all goes outside of these walls to other ministries. We just finished a Christmas offering where we said last week a $30,000 goal was $59,000 in the end. That is the spirit of generosity and a joyful experience of giving. But I want to acknowledge where the power was in this last offering and what I think is important for us to remember. Of the 59,000, 54 people participated. That's the win. In a wealthy culture of layers and layers of wealth, what's important for us to remember is Jesus never overlooked the smallest of gifts. In the temple that day, when he points out the widow who gave 2 mites, he doesn't say, oh, you don't need to give because you don't have anything. He just pointed out she has given more than everyone else, and clearly he blessed her in that experience. It's the community of faith where we participate together that makes us the generous community of Christ. But we all have to experience these things personally. And there might be one of these circles where this is where you have particularly been like made alive in some experience that you've had in your life. And more than likely, because you've experienced that in that specific way, it is probably also part of your spiritual gifts today. You have probably embraced it in some way that leans into the way God flows through you to bless others in one of these particular ways. They're all equal to each other. It's not like one is more faithful or more holy than the other. But today, we get to experience Christ's generosity that we remember every month together in the ceremony, the sacrament of communion, where we remind ourselves of the forgiveness and the generosity of Christ. And I wanted to, before we come to receive the communion this morning, hopefully I won't spill this. I just wanted to, in offering the words of sacrament, words of institution, I just wanted to remind you of something. In the water to wine experience, right, well, it says that the disciples were there. They experienced that time together. So when Jesus around the table is breaking the bread and said, "This is my body that's broken for you. Eat this in remembrance of me." And as he broke that bread, either then in that moment or possibly later on when they look back on it, don't you think they probably remembered the time that he just kept breaking the bread and feeding the 4,000 or feeding the 5,000? Just over and over. It's like the abundance of forgiveness of this table is indescribable. And then afterwards, he takes the cup and says, "This cup is the new covenant in my blood, sealed by the shedding of my blood. As often as you drink it, remember me." And in this act of receiving this gift of generosity of forgiveness, possibly they thought back to Jesus filling up, the servants filling up the glass to the very brim of the glass. Don't you think there's a message there for you today? For those of you that have lived a long time like myself, what we realize is that this gift of forgiveness is one of the greatest acts of generosity that we will ever receive. It gives us a new beginning. It restores us back to our true selves. And it offers us a platform in which to embody the generosity of Christ. But what I want to remind you today is it never stops. It just continues to be available to me and to you, so that we can receive and that we can offer it in return.